would like to introduce our panel. From Los Angeles, Winston Binch. From San Francisco, Toria Emery. And from Brooklyn, Caroline Sinders. To begin, we'll hear from Toria. Toria Emery is a creative director leading the copy and content strategy discipline at Sequence, a digital design studio. There, she is building a team that brings brands to life through connected experiences. Before arriving at Sequence, she was creative director of copy at Adobe, creative director at AKQA, and an ACD at Goodby Silverstein and Partners. One of her favorite projects was leading a team that created the first global alternate reality game. It spanned continents, multiple channels, and the real and digital worlds. Over the years, her work has won awards from the likes of Cannes, The One Show, and the D&AD. Thanks for joining us, Toria. We can now see your screen. Please go ahead with your introduction.
Hi, everybody. I see I'm getting to go first. So I'm going to talk about this future of content, which is really interesting because I feel more than ever the future of content is now. It's coming up on us so fast every day. I just want to check. I don't know, can you see the GoToWebinar control panel or just my screen?
No.
Okay. So first of all, I think there's always going to be a place for linear stories. Books, movies, TV, we always want to see the world through other people's eyes, but more and more content will respond to us. That's the kind of thing that more and more we want to see. Data-driven, hyper-personalized content that we kind of feed into and feeds back to us. And this is sort of a late-breaking thing that I added, this social action-oriented content, which we'll get to later, but definitely relevant to things that are happening politically here in the US and around the world. So first, the data-driven content. This is kind of how we sort of see personalized content today. If you come to a phone screen, how I see it, how you see it may be different depending on how we arrived there and the time that we've spent on that site. It's basically modules being moved around. But from here on out, it's going to be more about what goes beyond that. Environments, experiences, our habits even. Environments, I think we all know about smart homes and your lighting and music and all that kind of stuff responding to you when you get home. Similarly, experiences, how you get on a plane and how you experience a flight is different. How you go into a store and experience that is different. Even our habits with things like Fitbit, it can actually go from just measuring what we're doing to saying, hey, if you sleep an extra 15 minutes tonight, you can walk an extra 1,000 miles, 1,000 steps tomorrow. It actually can coach us through those things. That's content that helps us and is personalized to us. So more and more, we're seeing data kind of combined with machine learning and resulting in algorithms. And what I'm kind of saying is algorithms are content today. And we'll become used to seeing the world through layers of data. And this is already happening. I mean, Facebook, when you go to Facebook, what you see and what I see are different. Sometimes that's good, sometimes not so good. Recommendations from Amazon, Netflix, that's happening already. Pinterest is moving in this direction where what's served up to me is based on my preferences in pinning, and even face recognition software. All of that is happening and really informs everything we're seeing. And experiences, they're going to become less, it's not really about disruptive, it's more that they're seamless. I'm not going to have to go into my home and click on some app that says I'm home and have everything respond. It's really just going to happen based on my proximity or hearing me come through the door. Now, I included this quote from Dr. Phil, definitely someone you can think about more in terms of human relationships. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. But truly, this is true of technology as well. And here is a quote from Pedro Domingos, a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Washington. In reality, the main purpose of machine learning is to predict the future based on past behavior. It's kind of the same thing. Our relationships with each other, we're starting to have that relationship with technology. I'm sure you guys, many of you have heard the story of Netflix, how it greenlighted House of Cards. This was sort of a combination of data, bits and pieces, patterns that they put together based on, oh, these people, this bunch of users watched a David Fincher movie, The Social Network, from start to finish. A bunch of users watched Kevin Spacey movies from start to finish. House of Cards, the British version, was very popular, and they found these patterns and put them together. Obviously, they managed to create a hit. That doesn't always happen, but it did in this case. They also created 10 different versions of the trailer to appeal to all these different audiences, some focusing on the David Fincher aspect, some focusing on Kevin Spacey. Here's another example. This is a prototype of a smart mirror, and it's taking sort of a known API, weather, the date, the time, and kind of combining it with more learned habits like, oh, this user actually bikes to work, and this would not be a good day to bike. Apparently, they also have plants, hopefully indoors since it's snowing, and that is something that's a habit of theirs, and let's support that habit. And then we have chatbots, which is another form of content served up through data and AI. 3 different use cases here. We've got a financial advisor on the left, a sort of personal assistant on the right, and unfortunately my screen is hiding the last one, but a fashion one on the far right. So these, as you can see, and this is relevant to us as designers and thinkers and strategists, they all have a different personality depending on the use. And that's something where designers will really come to the party and need to contribute. Of course, the downsides to algorithmic content. These are screenshots created by a machine learning design product called The Grid. They all look the same. I have to tell you, these sites, I couldn't make heads or tails of them really. They were just kind of content plugged in without any form or sense of narrative. So I think we have to be wary of this kind of thing. I feel like it's easy to say, let's turn over our design chops to a machine. It's efficient for businesses to do, but as you can see, not necessarily effective. I'm sure on the flip side, the people who run this company will say, as it gets smarter and smarter, it'll get better and better. We'll see. Obviously, embedded bias, huge issue, something that's going to be talked about more and more. Over here is an example of 2 feeds based on whether you're liberal or conservative, and that's really like the tip of the iceberg of ways that bias can be embedded, whether you're depending on your race, your gender, these kinds of things can be traced back through the code to the person who's really handling that code, and we've got to be careful. And I don't know if you followed the story of Tay, which was Tay was a Microsoft chatbot that went out there, and basically Twitter trained Tay to be a total asshole and worse. So that's something that we also have to be careful of as we turn over the keys more and more to machines. So this quote here, if designers want to play a bigger role in the design of intelligent systems, they need to understand how to use data, how to use AI in the creation of these systems. This is something that's critical for us as a designer. We don't want to kind of be on the receiving end at the very end of the process and being asked to sort of make something pretty or make it look good. We want to be there at the get-go and really influence how something is working and functioning. This is the part that kind of is late breaking, but I really think that thanks to the 2016 US election, we could be entering a new era of activism and the content that goes along with that. It's really been interesting to watch. I mean, obviously this has started a long time ago with Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter and other things, but really this kind of content has just blossomed in the last couple of weeks. On Facebook, there are groups that were created by individuals, single people, that have grown into movements based on everything that's happening. Pantsuit Nation is an obvious version of that, and that is something that is becoming a movement with lots and lots of content being pushed out to people every day. And there's a ton of different sites that have, again, sprung up in the last week that are kind of helping people come together and figure out what their what course of action to take. In this space, what's next? Maybe some activist-oriented games. There's already things like that happened a long time ago, World Without Oil. There's things like Change the Air that kind of give people micro actions to make changes, and those could grow. VR activism that builds empathy. If you can see what it's like to be in solitary confinement, if you can see what it's like to be a refugee, you may have more empathy, and that may change how you feel about what's happening in the world. And there's just curriculum for activism happening. I've noticed lots of schools and universities are kind of creating curriculum around activism and running for office and things like that. It's an interesting time. And in this space, designers will need to be adept at understanding behavioral science, which explores how human action affects relationships and decision making. And this is, again, we need to get sort of upstream of the process and really start thinking through from a user's point of view if we want to influence change. Some design jobs of the future. I won't go through all of these, but many of them have to do with kind of voice interaction, like how you talk to machines, gestures, how they respond to you. AI persona designer, we saw some of those different chatbots and they had different personalities to them. Embodied interactions designer, things that sort of take up that whole space and kind of create those immersive experiences. And that's it. Thank you. I ran through that very fast.
Thank you, Toria. That was a great opening. Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Carolyn. Carolyn Sinders is an Eyebeam project fellow with BuzzFeed Eyebeam Open Lab, machine learning designer and artist. As part of her fellowship, Carolyn is building machine learning commenting systems to mitigate abuse. Prior to her fellowship, she was a user researcher at IBM Watson. Her work focuses on the intersection of ethnography, visual systems, machine learning, language, data, emotional trauma, and online harassment. Carolyn's work has been featured in the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston, Style.com, Fusion News, The Washington Post, New York Magazine, Baby Castle Gallery, IXDA, I/O, and the 32nd Chaos Communication Congress. Okay, Carolyn, we can now see your screen and your webcam. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
I just want to say hi. Let me know if you can or can't hear me. And Toria, I feel like it's probably very happenstance that I'm going after your talk, primarily because as mentioned earlier, I worked on software to help design chatbots at IBM Watson. I was a user researcher and UX designer while there. And what's funny is the presentation I'm giving is about activism-oriented VR games. One second, I'm going to quickly move something. Oh, never mind. So hi, my name is Caroline Sinders. I hold a master's from the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU. I studied under Clay Shirky. He is a theorist around social media and political uses of social media. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about VR, usually I talk a lot about online harassment, machine learning, is that I actually don't get a lot of opportunity to talk about VR. And I think VR is this really sort of fascinating space as a designer to exist in, especially as a user experience designer. It's something where we're sort of starting to create all of our standards, and we can look at things that have been pre-existing, like photography or theater, immersive theater, even like how roboticists work with large-scale robots that are in sort of industrial design scenarios. But I think it's right now, in particular, it's this sort of beautifully untapped space, primarily with the focus on empathy. So I'm gonna go. Oh, so for those that don't know, the GIF behind the text is Thomas Drake. He is a whistleblower from the U.S. government. He predates WikiLeaks. He's talking a lot about surveillance that that the United States government was doing on their own citizens. So this game I created with my partner Mani Nilchani is called Dark Patterns, and one of the things we were interested in exploring, he is a web developer and a designer, was this idea of what will inform the future of the internet and design, particularly when we're starting to create systems that accidentally surveil through data catching, data caching, large-scale databases, the ideas of privacy regulation, immersive design. So as a designer, I think a lot about when you start to put something into code, given that I worked with chatbots. So if you create a rule, like the bot can't say certain words, that's not just a rule, it's a programmatic element, and then it becomes a policy element. It becomes a rule and like a handbook that someone has to read. But all of those rules as designers get distilled into some form of design, especially if you're enabling people to set up chatbots. So when I was at IBM, one of the things we would work on is software to where you wouldn't have to know how to program to set up a chatbot. So if there's a rule that we're coming up with, which is let's enable a way for people to censor out certain words or create a specific list to avoid harassment, that rule has to manifest somewhere for someone that doesn't have a background in programming. That rule has to then manifest into a form of user experience design, so someone can then put these words into a bank somewhere. They can put them into a database. There has to be a form on a page for someone to fill these things out. So Mani and I, we were really influenced by the lead up to the election, and now incredibly influenced around the post-election, as to what the future would look like if we are engaging with IoT, the Internet of Things objects, and then ideas around surveillance, particularly in a post-Snowden world. So if you don't know what Signal is a really fantastic app that you can use to securely text people. The reason it's really secure is that, as Edward Snowden is mentioning in this tweet, the FBI came after Signal to find out that the only thing that they log, the only thing that they hold on to in a database is when you've created your account and the last time you've logged in. Google, for example, holds on to a lot more. It holds on to a lot more of your metadata, holds on to deleted objects, deleted things. Google, often, if subpoenaed, may actually give over emails that you have, etc. So if you're using Google and you're trying to create elements of safety, it's actually like not that safe. A lot of your information can be handed over. And so Mani and I were really intrigued by this idea to try to hypothesize the future of a regulated web and interconnected life, particularly as we start to move more and more towards this Internet of Things and interconnected objects. For instance, hooking your phone up to your car and being able to dial from the interface of the car, having a tweeting refrigerator, for example, or using your phone to connect to like Nest to adjust the AC in your home, etc., things like that. So we started to think about what would be like the future of this kind of immersion, and we wanted to sort of think about reconstructing like believable immersive experience. So we started looking at ways to create alternatives of creating spaces, and we started looking at like the history of immersive spaces. And one thing we wondered as VR designers is, does a piece need to be believable to be immersive? Oops, sorry. So we decided to talk to people that were incredibly well versed in like what is web surveillance. So we spoke to Fred Jennings of Tor Eklund. That is a law firm that handles mainly digital rights, and they actually represent a series of different people that are being persecuted by the government, specifically around digital laws. One of their clients includes Matthew Keys, who's an LA Times reporter who was charged with being responsible or being a part of a hack that Anonymous engaged in to DDoS to bring down the LA Times for over an hour. Sorry. And so we started, so after talking to Fred, we had a series of questions as to like what could the future of politics be, what could the future of law be inside of interconnected spaces, inside of these interconnected objects. Will we be passing new kinds of regulation? What would that look like? And again, we were trying to approach it from a design standpoint. So if there's something that is allowed or not allowed, do users need to be aware of that? Meaning if, let's say, there start to be more regulations on like when and how we use the internet, or if at certain points to access a certain amount of like download speed or to download from certain sites, will those things start to be regulated, and will consumers have to be aware? Will that then change the way in what our browser looks like? So for example, if you ever open up cookies to see like who's accessing different parts of your site or different websites you're on, you'll see like this sort of mishmash of like different ad companies like taking information from different sites that you're on, right? Like they're just pinging it. And so one thing we were curious about is like will this ever happen from like a legislative standpoint? Will this ever happen from like a legal standpoint? And then what would it look like to try to inform people about this, right? Like should users be informed? How will this actually look inside of a web browser, inside of a web interface? So then this sort of led to us thinking about the idea of spatiality in VR, and this idea of like immersive content. And then further bring up this idea of like, if we're creating these spaces in VR, will it mimic things like augmented reality? Does it have to be completely immersive? So this is a GIF that we found to be sort of really enjoyable, or just around this idea of what are you creating inside of a space, and how does this reflect outside of a space? So we started to look at like the past as to how spatiality and geometry was represented, especially through pop culture. So one of the things we were both really into was this actually Canadian TV show called Reboot that I grew up watching in the United States. And we started looking at Minority Report. So we wanted to get an idea of historically how were these immersive spaces represented as layers inside of the space we were to interact in. If all of our objects are going to be connected, that means that a ceiling can actually be a screen, and that a wall can be a touch screen, right? It can be a touchpad. So that means that like every flat surface around us can actually be something that's connected to your phone or to a laptop. It can be an extension of an interactive point. So all of a sudden, like a white wall isn't just a white wall, it's a place where you can seamless. It becomes a place where you can access Facebook. And so what does that look like to then be surrounded by like pop-ups, for example? And is there a way to sort of push that forward? And again, this is more from Reboot, where this character is now covered by like a virtual reality blanket that like melts away. So it's not an actual blanket, it's a projection that looks like a blanket. So then we started to think about like what would be these versions of reality, and how is reality, especially in storytelling, like represented inside of this incredibly immersive space. So one is the reconstruction through expansion. So in this image, this is Franz Rubila. It's the Battle of Borodino. It's a panoramic painting. It's from 1812. So depending upon where you are in different parts of the painting, you're seeing incredibly different. You're seeing one battle, but you're incredibly surrounded by it. And one thing Monty and I had been thinking about was with this push towards 360, with 360 video and 360 imaging, what could we show inside of a panel? Because all of a sudden, like our space isn't just one image; it's a 360 image. A mentor of mine, Luc Dubois, often talks about VR being a bit like opera. It has to be believable that someone would burst into song. So with an opera, it has to be so extreme, so unbelievable, so engrossing that it would make complete and utter sense that an actor would burst into song to describe what they're feeling. And with VR, it's sort of similar to a panoramic image. It has to be so encompassing, so large, that every aspect of the image itself must be stitched around you, because the only way to experience it must be to experience all of it. So how do you make something that feels like it should burst into song? And the song doesn't have to be happy. It can be sad. It can be inquisitive. It can be invigorating. It can be questioning. From there, we looked at Jessica Brillhart's work. She's the principal filmmaker at Google on VR, and she's working with a 6-camera rig. So this is her climbing up a rock in Iceland. And she started to create these really incredible and beautiful artifacts and photographs from this 6-camera rig that sort of exist outside regular time and space, right? Like, this isn't what it looks like to actually climb up unless we're from a very strange standpoint. But it sort of created this really beautiful continuation in artifact. That was something we were interested in exploring. So from here, we started to think about how could like a plane be divided into different areas of interaction and still be stitched together. One of the reasons we were looking at this is like, if the first thing in front of you is what you're interacting with, and then there's like different sides and different points that will drag your vision and bring you to the next panel. That panel is stitched to the one to the side of it, though. So then we started to think about the simulation of facades. My collaborator Mani is actually from Iran, and this was one of the most fascinating things about working with him, is he sort of brought this really amazing history of art to our project we were working with. So this is an image from the Shiraz School, and what you can see is an incredibly expansive story that's existing in one plane, right? There's a lot of things happening here. So from inside this one plane, you can see that there's 2 people about to engage in fight in front of a door, and someone else is falling to the ground. Into the next plane, there's something else happening, and it's all happening in one screen and one standpoint. And you can also see, like, from where it's being selected, that it's a natural movement from like one side of the plane to the other. But what you can also see here is like these hints of spatial mimicry, which sort of allow you to snap in and out of different modes that are reconstructing the space in one space, and just in one space and one plane to engage with. So then we started looking at David Hockney's work. My background's actually in photography before I got my master's in technology. One thing we were interested in is, how do you build out a world inside of VR that isn't using video, that could use photography in a way that didn't feel flat and that felt engaging? So we started looking at David Hockney's work. David Hockney would photograph like hundreds of photographs of a scene and stitch them together. And what it does is it starts to create this multi-layered, very in-depth space. A photograph can feel very flat, especially if it's being engaged with on a screen, but this is sort of a way to create the illusion of 3D in a plane that's totally 2D. Here's some more of David Hockney's work. And so one of the things we started to think about was this idea of visual mimicry, and this idea of photography being a representation of truth, and how can this dynamic really inform the idea of immersion? The thing that's fascinating about photography is that it is like what is perceived to be truth of a scene. It is a certain kind of reality because it's pulling from a very real space. But photography is sort of a relative truth. It's not exactly what is happening. And so one thing we were interested in playing with was this idea of, if we could photograph a real space, all of a sudden we could then hypothesize like these future interfaces, and would it make it feel more real because it's existing inside of a space that we are actually photographing. It's existing inside of a very, very real space. So I photographed Mani's living room, and we were playing around with these different ideas of how to build out a space. And in the actual VR space, we ended up layering the photographs in a 3D space a couple inches apart from each other. So these photographs are not flattened or stitched together. They're actually existing with space in between them. So if you were looking at it from a side, you'd see like photograph, 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 photograph. So one thing we also started to think about too is if this was a space that I was looking at through glasses or through or something with my phone, there was projection, like what would it look like to have notifications and where would they go? Well, they'd be to the side. They would be blocking my view. This is, again, more of the space that we had started to build out. And then this is a GIF we've made of the game, of just what it's like to be in the room that we were building. So the idea is it's going over your TV screen, because that is a screen you'd actually engage with and sit down with. And from here, I don't know if you can tell, but on the side, it's telling you how many credits you've used to start browsing anonymously, how many credits you have to sort of download things, and what the person's trying to open up is an encrypted file. And to open up the encrypted file, they have to pay to do that. And they're receiving different kinds of notifications. And as they're clicking on things, in the very back, which is hard to read, it's telling you what laws are allowing you to access certain things and like what is running in the background. And after talking to Fred Jennings of Tor Eklund, that's sort of something that seems like one of the most actual realities, which is if we start to derail net neutrality, we're going to have companies buying different aspects of our kind of internet freedom, meaning you'll see things like under the law of protection of users in public space, you know, the New York State government and Verizon have passed this law together, which is allowing Verizon to allow you to do these certain things, but it's also being then read or caught through these kinds of limitations from a governmental standpoint. So one thing we were thinking about is what would it be like to have things that feel like the way they feel now, things that feel like a more open net, but in actuality on the back end they're not open at all. And what would that start to look like from an interface standpoint? This is one of my favorite GIFs, so I'm just including it. But this is one of the reasons we were thinking about the web in general is it's a really fantastic space where you can interact with people over and over and over again. And what would it be like if our web could all of a sudden be like meticulous and messy and projected? And it already feels that way. Like there's so many different things you can do. It's so expansive. The web isn't just one thing. It is a place to congregate. It's a place to engage in political action. It is also a place to buy and shop and to do very mundane things like pay your bills. What would it be like to sort of create a visual metaphor for how immersive the web is? And so that's one of the reasons we started to turn to VR and AR. And it also just sort of seems like the next natural progression that like things will then be projected and very interactable inside of our daily lives the second we start to step into home. So we ended up building it using A-frame, and we wanted to sort of when we were installing this in an art gallery, we started to think about how people would actually interact with it. We realized we wanted to sort of use something that felt a little hacky, but also bring it more back to a game space. So we started thinking about, you know, would someone want to walk around with this? We decided that we wanted it to be playable on the phone. It was sort of also a metaphor around the idea that if everything's interconnected, the game itself should actually be able to be playable on the most interconnected thing you have, which is a smartphone. And we decided to use cardboard because it's one of the cheapest and easiest ways to actually engage with VR. And it seems like because of the invention of cardboard, more and more VR will actually be designed to run on mobile and then engage with on cardboard. And same with the Samsung Gear and even like the Nexus. So this is like what our setup actually looked like. And that's it.
Thank you, Caroline. Excellent. Finally, we'll hear from Winston. Winston Binch is the Chief Digital Officer of Deutsch North America, where he has created breakthrough campaigns and products for brands such as Taco Bell, Volkswagen, and Target, and has transformed the agency from an advertising agency to innovator. a feat that led Fast Company to recognize Deutsch as one of the most innovative companies in advertising. His work has picked up honors from the One Show, Communication Arts, UX Awards, AICP, the Andes, Effie Awards, and the Webby Awards. He has won at Cannes 41 times, including 3 Titanium Lions, 3 Grand Prix Awards, and Interactive Agency of the Year 3 times. Winston, it's all you.
Oh, hey there. Hey, everybody. Wow, those were fantastic presentations. Thank you very much. I'm going to dumb it down a little bit, I think. I'm going to talk about advertising and ideas and really focus, content's such a broad topic and thing. I'm going to really focus on tech-driven content. I've had a lot of experience with it. I make a lot of ads and do a lot of narrative-driven storytelling work, but I'm going to talk about tech. And specifically how to use ad thinking to design things that are impossible to ignore, like Cookie Monster. So just a quick bit about me. My name's Winston Binch. I grew up with a real disdain for advertising because when I was a kid, this slogan, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should, it worked, and that's what I heard over and over and over again. But the reality is now I've been in an ad environment for 10 years, and before that I worked at an agency called RGA. Caroline, I think you did as well. And on the Nike account, and I spent a lot of time developing and designing technology and e-commerce products for Nike, one of them being Nike ID, and some of their other e-commerce properties. And then prior to that, I was in the music business and worked at Sony Music Online. And so I've worked across, a spectrum of creativity from music, tech, to advertising. And, one thing I've found that, one of the reasons why I've stayed in this environment is that I've bought into the power of creativity and what it can do for design and for products. And, Fred Wilson, I'm a fan of his, but he really, this quote, marketing is what you do when your product's sucky. He's completely right about that, but the reality is most products suck, right? And I think many have seen this slide. This is the AdTech or brand tech ecosystem, and there's a massive failure rate, right? With startups, over 90% don't make it. And I think having a story and a point of view and a brand is more important now than it's ever been before. And in particularly as we're designing and thinking about all types of content. We wake up here at Deutsch every day, and this is what we're thinking about, this notion that no one really gives a shit about what you have to say. And they don't wake up wanting to have a conversation with a brand or check out your piece of content or use your app or use your bot. You've got to build a compelling reason, and it has to go beyond just solving a problem. You can't just be about function. There's got to be an emotional connection, a reason why. So I'm going to talk about two things, two principles, that I've used and developed over the years, and we do here, to really make your content pretty sticky and both usable and functional. So number one, everything needs an idea. And I grew up when I was at RGA. I learned a ton about designing smart UX-driven products that were highly functional. And when I was at Crispin Porter McGusky, which was followed that in Miami, Florida, and Boulder, I learned about the power of creativity, storytelling, and PR, and really principally the power of an idea. And if you think about ideas, right, adages, things that last thousands of years are ideas. They're things that can be passed along. They're easy to remember. They're fluid. And so one example I want to talk about is Volkswagencom. I've made a lot of car sites over the years. Toria, maybe you have with your AKQA experience as well. And most of them are just glorified brochures. They're really pretty boring and really not that useful either. They serve up really what the business wants you to see, and they're not driven or built around user needs. So we did a redesign for them a few years ago, and it's one of my favorite projects I've worked on, because the brief was create a innovation for the category and help drive sales to 800,000 units. And so there was a sales function, but there was also an innovation component. And as we approached this, we really wanted to make something radically simple, but really did solve a problem for shoppers. And most car sites, if you go to them, particularly in the States, we're in North America, it's a stock-based car market, unless you're buying a Tesla or something pretty fancy. So, when you go on a car site, everyone's got a configurator. You configure what we started calling unicorns. You configure a car, you fall in love with it, and then you take it to the dealership, and the dealer usually tells you, well, we don't have that one. We have something similar. And that just felt really weird, particularly in an immediate gratification society, right, where we can order things, and get a meal in minutes and beyond. Or Tinder and dating. We felt like this was not in keeping with what expectations that were digital shoppers were. So we wanted to change. The team went off and they said, hey, we've got a great idea. And they came back and they said, check this out. And I said, well, here it is. It's a nonlinear inventory search tool. And I got where they were going with this, and what they were basically saying is that we want to be completely transparent about our inventory. We want to serve up cars nearby people based on their preferences. But this is not an idea. That's not something that I would remember, want to share, and it just didn't hit me emotionally. And I always look for ideas, even if they're in tech and design, to hit me emotionally. That's how people, it just helps with build the memory structure. So we ended up looking at a prototype early on, as one of the developers did. And, I love this concept of being able to shop by preference. And then if you think, and we started thinking about it, it was very similar to the process of dating, both a rational and a highly emotional decision. You like blonde, I like blondes, blue eyes, I'm describing my wife, but you're going through this process. So we actually came up with this metaphor or analog, right, which was really what we were building as a dating site for cars. And we leaned into this, and it was a 18-month or 20-month project. It kind of scared us because this was a very serious category. But we wanted to inject some fun into it, and it ended up really working both for the brand and the product. And the point what I've learned here is that when you're designing, customer-facing technology, you don't let the engineering get in the way. Remember that people are humans and relate to them on creative and very personal and human ways, and it'll be highly effective. So, one thing we're big in, what we learn about from advertising is most of our job is to drive awareness and consideration. And when you're working in e-commerce, of course, you can drive bottom line in sales immediately, which is why I love e-commerce. It's like creativity with consequences. But you can see here that we got, press for this idea that we put in on the world. VW.com takes a page from online dating to help you find a car. VW's new website channels Tinder. And we really pre-engineered a lot of this early in the process, and it really helped. And beyond the PR impact, treating tech like an idea or marketing, we also increased sales conversions or leads by 60%. So this became a very effective tool for the brand. So everything needs an idea. I don't care what it is. If it's, we don't start with scripts. We don't start with UX. We start with the customer, and then we find an idea that solves a problem for them, and we do it, or we try to do it in a remarkable way. Number 2, firsts. And I don't mean just any first. I mean meaningful ones that it doesn't matter. I think you can be a fast follower as long as you improve the whatever you're creating. And I think you've got to solve real problems, not ones you've invented. But first are important. And, we've been on the topic of AI in the last two presentations. We're really passionate about it here. We've done a bunch of experiments on behalf of clients. One of our more recent ones is something called TacoBot that we made for Taco Bell this last spring. This was a beta, and it was the first ever Slack bot that you could order food through, tacos, off the platform. And what was really important about this was organically created by the team that was working on the e-commerce platform, and really it came out of just the insight that the team had is, it's difficult to do group orders for food online, and as the messenger bots were kind of blowing up and Slack was blowing up, our whole team was on Slack during the build of the site. This idea came forward. And what I loved about it was that it felt brand new. And I think what I love about the promise of bots, and I think everyone on this panel would acknowledge it's still very early days, but they both can be emotional, and again, getting back to function, there's two things there that can happen. And this idea, TacoBot, we spent a minimal amount of money on it, and the brand ended up getting about 10 million worth in earned media, and I think that speaks to both the power of being first, but also unique and novel and meaningful. And the thing I love about this also is it's not a destination, right? It's a system, and it's one that can also engage and entertain our customers, but also drive the bottom line. And this is some of the reviews. You can see some of the publications that wrote about it. Again, it had a real PR impact for us. And then, what I loved, I don't know, Caroline, if you were one of our users, but we launched with a small group of companies and had over 1,200 signups from lots of our tech heroes, particularly AI heroes. So, that was, I think that the tech team was pretty excited about that. But getting back to this PR notion, and it's you don't get it right every time, but there's some things you can do to really kind of improve your chances. Now, what I'm about to show you here, this is not an activist-oriented game, and I think it dates itself a little bit. It's a game that was created for PlayStation for their game called Twisted Metal, and this was done 4 or 5 years ago. By the way, I do love this notion of activist-oriented games. I think they could be amazing. But what I want to talk about here is something we call the idea charter, and we used it on both the ideas I just showed you, and it's what we use early in the process, and really as we're vetting ideas, and there's 3 things that we look for. 1, give your idea, your concept, a sticky name. Something that's going to, really serve as a handle. Think back to the TacoBot. People just love saying that. And then previously, the VW.com concept we called Matchmaker. But the dating site thing came through. The other thing we do is we try and figure out what would the press write about this. Whether it's the New York Times, Mashable, Beyond, The Verge, it doesn't matter who. It really comes down to who you're talking to. But you really want to pre-design that press, right? And then also we talk about fluidity and people being able to share your idea. You have to describe it in less than 140 characters, and that of course is built around Twitter. But what we're talking about here is brevity, and you could call it the pub test or the elevator test. You've really got to be able to be succinct. And still, most of the ideas that come across my desk are maybe written up in two-page form. They're 2 pages long, and that's just not an idea. You've got to dig and edit yourself. So those are a couple of the thoughts I had on designing tech-driven content. And the last thing I'd say here is that our agency mission that we launched a few years ago is to invent the most original and shareable work in the world. And It's intentionally audacious and like super difficult, because I think we're acknowledging that, you know, we are competing as brands and advertising agencies with those awesome gifts that Caroline shared and everything else that exists on the internet today. And really, if you look what's going on, the general public is probably more creative than the creative industry in many ways. There's more volume, but they're also reactive, they're in culture, they're relevant. And we as creative companies have to strive to compete with what they're doing. And so originality, you know, we ask these questions of everything we do. And again, we mostly probably don't get it right. But originality to me again comes back to this news idea. Does it feel like news? It doesn't have to be brand new, but it has to feel like news. And the shareability piece is super important, whether it's VR, AI, web, mobile, beyond. You've got to find a way to make a dollar work like $10 million. We talk about content right now. My clients, I think everyone's, they're really struggling because there's so many new platforms, and that the marketing budgets aren't going up. So you've got to find a way to make your ideas so great that people just want to talk about them and share them. So that's it from me.